Before we begin, there's something that I really want all parents and educators to know. Students who learn differently are not destined to a lifetime of learning struggles, even if they have dyslexia or auditory processing difficulties or some other type of roadblock that keeps them from learning the same way that their peers do. That doesn't mean we have to keep spinning our wheels and getting nowhere when we try to help them. With the right kind of learning intervention, children with a whole host of learning differences can succeed beyond anyone's wildest expectations. That's important for you to know. I'm guessing, and I'm really hoping, that one reason that you're here is because you really want to learn what it means to provide the right kind of learning intervention. If that's true, or even if you're just a little bit curious about this, please do stick with me. To keep it simple, I'm breaking down the information in this training into 5 short lessons. That way, if you need to take a break and come back to it later, you'll have a few good starting and stopping points. So, here's what you're going to learn. Lesson 1, why traditional forms of learning interventions so often fail our students who learn differently. Lesson 2, 5 key elements of successful learning intervention. Lesson 3, a few signs of learning difficulties that parents and educators can learn to watch out for, beyond the obvious. Lesson 4, executive function, what it is and how we can optimize executive function skills. And finally, Lesson 5, one very important secret to helping kids succeed at learning, especially kids with learning differences. Plus, at the very end of this mini training, I'll share where you can find me if you want to learn more. So let's dive in to Lesson 1. Why traditional forms of learning intervention can fail our students who learn differently. Oftentimes, well-meaning approaches to learning intervention focus primarily on academic skills. Does your child have trouble reading? Let's focus a lot more on reading. The same thing goes for math or spelling or writing. Naturally, that sounds perfectly reasonable, right? But there's a problem with that. It neglects all of the underlying cognitive skills that make reading and other academics possible in the first place. Before we can help children learn academics or reading, writing, and arithmetic, we must first ensure that they can process the information that we're presenting. Our brains are constantly processing all sorts of information. They process what we see, hear, touch. We can determine where something is, how far away it is from us, how big or small, how colorful or loud or soft it is, etc. Ordinarily, students develop these underlying processing skills naturally, so that by the time they reach kindergarten, they are already ready to learn. Other times, we need to take an active role in helping children develop stronger cognitive connections. Many traditional intervention programs miss this, which is one reason they so often fail our struggling learners. So, why do some kids need extra help with this and not others? Well, the debate about what causes dyslexia and other so-called learning disabilities lives on. Of course, we know that genetics can play a role in some children's readiness to learn. We also know that a number of other factors can impact a child's brain development. For instance, if a child experiences severe emotional trauma, that's going to affect the connections the brain wants to prioritize. In this case, it'll likely prioritize survival over anything else. And sometimes the brain gets stuck there in survival mode. So the building blocks of learning have to take a back seat. Another factor might be that as an infant, the child's movement was, for one reason or another, restricted in some way. That, too, may interfere with healthy development of critical neural pathways. These are just a few examples. Let me make an important distinction here. I'm not talking about kids who simply haven't had enough exposure to books in the early years. Those kids may not necessarily be wired differently, in which case they do tend to make up for lost time once school begins. So if they are behind and intervention is warranted, then these kids may respond just fine to traditional methods of intervention. This may include a lot of repetition of the same academic lessons that they failed the first time around. For the kids who are wired differently, if we don't help these learners strengthen processing skills and other cognitive abilities, It's quite unfair of us to keep piling on the academics and then scratch our heads wondering why on earth our students are still floundering. It's not the child's fault. We missed an important step. We missed the most important step, which then naturally impacts all of the learning to follow. This is super important, and yet, unfortunately, it's far too often overlooked. If you've ever looked into reading intervention programs, for example, Barton or Wilson or All About Reading, those are reading programs. Reading is an academic skill. Before we can teach academics successfully, so that new information actually sticks and we're not just spinning our wheels going nowhere, we need to make sure that children's underlying cognitive skills are strong enough to support their academics. Now, this is where our own understanding, our own personal judgment of what a child should or should not be able to do is critically important. If you hear nothing else from this training, please do hear this. It is for parents, it is for teachers, it is for all specialists who work with learners of all kinds. Our assumptions and our expectations inform how we approach learning intervention, which then directly impacts how successful we can be at providing that intervention. So if we teach a child that this is the letter A and it says naturally we expect them to be able to eventually absorb that information, at least maybe by about the 4th or 5th time that we teach it. If they don't, we might assume that this particular child simply isn't bothering to pay attention to us, or that the child is uncooperative, or lazy, or even outright defiant. Our own interpretation of what we see may be clouding the truth of the matter, and that, of course, informs our reaction to the child. In the case of dyslexic learners, those negative assumptions are not true at all. Many dyslexic learners have an especially difficult time making sense of what they see on a page. You know, those lines all over the place that the rest of us, we recognize as letters. So it's not the child's fault for not being able to catch on as we would expect them to. It's our own method of teaching in a way that they're simply unable to learn. Why? Because they're wired differently. They learn differently. If we then react poorly to them because we assume they're being obstinate, we might trigger a cascade of negative emotions in that child based upon our own incorrect assumptions and expectations. Let's not do that. Bottom line, yes, we can teach all kinds of learners in the ways that they learn best. No, targeted cognitive skills training is not complicated to learn or to provide. I promise no PhD is required. When we remain curious instead of judgmental, we can keep our own expectations from getting in the way of seeing the truth, seeing what's really going on. And then we can provide effective learning intervention from that better place of understanding. When you've tried to help a child with something, have you ever caught yourself thinking, oh my goodness, we've gone over this 1,000 times already. Why is this child not getting it? First of all, please consider that to be totally natural and understandable. Second of all, consider it to be one of your cues or triggers, if you will. Let it trigger more curiosity instead of judgment. Like, I wonder what's going on underneath all of this struggle. You don't have to know the answer, just observe. From that place, you can be more compassionate, more patient, more understanding, and then you can dig deeper to find the real solution. Now, I may be a little biased here because I do provide in-depth training for parents and educators who want to provide effective learning intervention. But personally, I believe parents are in the perfect position to learn how to dig deeper. If that's not possible for you right now, don't worry. Simply find someone who can provide targeted cognitive skills training. We'll see what that looks like in lesson 2. First, let's get back to our own expectations for just a moment. We also want to manage our own expectations about our very hardworking teachers, what they should or should not be able to provide. And that goes for teachers themselves, too. I'm going to share with you an all too common complaint that I hear from teachers over and over and sadly over again. It goes a little something like this. I went to school for my, and fill in the blank here, my teaching credential, my master's degree in education, my reading specialist certificate, even my special education degree. And here's what they say. And I didn't learn a thing about dyslexia or other learning disabilities. What? If you are a teacher, you might be nodding your head right now. If so, it breaks my heart, of course, but please know that it's not your fault. If you are a parent and you've been expecting the school to have all of the answers, then this common complaint may be one reason why you've probably been disappointed and why your learner continues to struggle. Yes, I too truly wish that most schools no longer functioned with a one-size-fits-all approach. However, your frustration might have been the thing that led you to me in the first place and to this training here. So please do take heart. Better answers are available to you. Speaking of which, let's move on to lesson 2. 5 key elements of successful learning intervention.